Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if those tools we use to measure prejudice and stereotypes are really as solid as they seem? Because as this new study shows, that is a question with some surprising answers. So there is this big question in psychology: how do we actually measure something as complicated and important as prejudice? We all know prejudice is a huge problem in society, right? It causes so much harm. If we want to understand it, and more importantly, if we want to reduce it, we need good ways to measure it. But what if the tools we've been using for decades aren't as reliable or valid as we thought? That is exactly what a team of researchers set out to investigate. Think about it. Sometimes these prejudice measures are even used in really important situations, like deciding who gets on a jury or in legal cases. If the measurement tools aren't good, that could lead to some really unfair outcomes. For a long time, psychologists have been developing all sorts of ways to measure prejudice. We've got the direct ones, where you just ask people how they feel or what they think about certain groups. These are called explicit measures. Then there are the indirect ones, like the implicit association test, or IAT, which try to tap into unconscious biases. And then there are behavioral measures, where they look at actual actions. The problem is, there are so many different ways to measure prejudice, and it is hard to know which ones are actually good. Are they measuring what they say they're measuring? Do they give consistent results? This is where psychometrics comes in, which is basically the science of measuring things, especially in psychology. So the researchers decided to do something massive. They went through thousands and thousands of studies. We're talking about over 13,000 research records. They narrowed it down to include 263 studies that were published over a very long period from 1951 all the way up to 2024. Their goal was to look at all the different ways prejudice and stereotypes have been measured, and to see how good the quality of those measurements actually is. They were looking at things like reliability, which means if you measure the same thing again, do you get a similar result? And validity, which means is it really measuring prejudice and not something else? So how did they do this huge review? They set up a really careful system following standards called Prisma and Cosmin. This means they had a plan before they even started. They were super organized, and they tried to be as transparent as possible. Two researchers independently went through all the studies to make sure they were picking the right ones. They looked for studies that focused on racial and ethnic prejudice and stereotypes, that used explicit, implicit, or behavioral measures, and critically, that actually reported on the psychometric properties, that is, the quality of the measurement itself. They even reached out to authors if some information was missing, which is pretty dedicated. After all that sifting and sorting, they ended up with 263 studies. Now, let's see what they found. The research they looked at mostly came from journal articles, but a good chunk was also from dissertations. Now, here is an interesting first point. A lot of these studies were done in the USA. Over half of them came from US samples. When they looked at how prejudice was measured, most of the time it was with explicit measures like surveys where people directly answer questions about their attitudes. This makes sense. It is the most straightforward way to ask someone something. But here is where things start to get a little tricky. When they looked at how researchers define prejudice, they found that only about a third of the studies actually gave a clear definition. That is a pretty big deal. If you are not clearly defining what you are measuring, how can you be sure your measurement is accurate? Another big finding was how prejudice was conceptualized. Most of the time, researchers focused on prejudice as an individual thing, like one person's attitude. They paid less attention to it as something happening at a bigger level, like within society's structures or ideologies. And in terms of what they were measuring, they most often focused on the cognitive part, what people think, rather than the emotional or behavioral parts. This means we might be missing a whole lot of what prejudice really is. We tend to focus on what people think, but what about how they feel or how they act? Those are crucial parts of prejudice too. Now, let's talk about the actual quality of these measurements. This is where the grade assessment comes in. Think of grade like a quality score for the evidence. And the results were, frankly, a bit alarming. Across all the studies and measurements they looked at, only a tiny fraction, just 4.3%, got a high overall quality rating. Most of them ended up in the low or very low categories. This means that for a lot of the tools used to measure prejudice, the evidence for their reliability and validity is pretty weak. They might be inconsistent, or there might be a high risk of bias in the studies that use them. What were the biggest problems? Well, things like good research practices were often rated as inadequate. That can include things like not pre-registering studies, not sharing data, or not being transparent about how they got their results. The studies also often lacked information on content validity, which is about whether the questions actually cover all the important aspects of prejudice. And worryingly, temporal stability, that is how consistent the measure is, over time was rarely assessed. And let's talk about the really important types of validity. Discriminant validity, which means the measure is different from other similar measures, and predictive validity, which means it actually predicts real-world behavior or tested very, very rarely. If a measure can't predict behavior or isn't different from other measures, then what is it really measuring? So, what does this all mean? The researchers are saying that while these measures have been useful and have allowed us to do a lot of research, the foundation they stand on, the quality of the measurement, is often shaky. It is like having a beautiful house built on a weak foundation. It might look good and it might have stood for a while, but it is at risk. The big takeaway here is that the field of prejudice measurement needs a serious upgrade. We need to be much clearer about what exactly we mean when we define prejudice. We need to move beyond just asking about individual thoughts and include emotions and behaviors more. And most importantly, we need to do better science when we're creating and using these measurement tools. That means more rigorous testing for reliability and validity, being more transparent in our research practices, and a lot more cross-cultural research. Because if we're primarily studying prejudice in one cultural context like the US, we might be missing how it shows up differently in other parts of the world. The researchers suggest a few key directions for the future. First, let's get clearer definitions. Second, let's move beyond just checking internal consistency and really dive deep into all the different types of validity, especially temporal stability and predictive validity. Third, they're calling for more multi-method approaches, combining different types of measures to get a fuller picture. And finally, they stress the importance of transparent and reproducible research practices, like sharing data and pre-registering studies. Basically, this study is a wake-up call. It highlights a paradox. We have a lot of theory about prejudice, but the tools we use to study it are often not as scientifically solid as they should be. This can lead to misleading conclusions and ineffective interventions, but it is not all doom and gloom. By recognizing these limitations, researchers can now work to build better, more reliable, and more culturally sensitive tools for understanding and ultimately combating prejudice. It is about making sure our science is as strong as the important issues it tries to address. What do you all think about these findings? Does it change how you view research on prejudice and stereotypes? Let me know in the comments below, and if you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more science explained simply. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.